I'm a 29-year-old guy, and I've always had a complicated relationship with my family. There's my younger sister, who's 27 and has this constant need to compete with me. And then there's my younger brother, 25, the golden child. I've always been the responsible one, the dependable son who helps out with everything while my siblings seem to coast through life. That's why what happened recently caught me completely off guard and has left me reeling. It all started with a chance encounter at a coffee shop. I was grabbing my usual morning coffee when I spotted the family lawyer, Mr. Jenkins. He's known us for years, handled all the family's legal stuff, wills, trusts, everything. It felt a bit awkward bumping into him since it was out of the blue. I went over, exchanged pleasantries, and made a joke about him working too hard. He looked surprised, almost like he wasn't expecting to see me there. Then he slipped up. He mentioned something about hoping the changes to the will weren't causing any family drama. I was like, what changes? The look on his face said it all. He realized he'd said too much and tried to backpedal, saying it wasn't his place to discuss anything and that I should talk to my parents. I didn't press him further right there, but the pit in my stomach grew. Changes to the will? Why would there be changes? And why was I not aware of them? I left the coffee shop and went straight home, feeling this uneasy sense of urgency. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. It made me think about the past few months and how strange things had been with my parents lately. My mom, especially, had been distant. She'd started ignoring my calls or making excuses about why she couldn't meet up. My dad didn't seem any different on the surface, but he's always been the type to go along with whatever my mom decides, so it was hard to tell. Then there's the issue with my siblings. My sister and I have always had a tense relationship. She has this way of undermining me, making snide comments, and generally acting like she's competing for our parents' attention. My brother, on the other hand, is practically worshipped by them. He's the one who can do no wrong, and everyone seems to bend over backward to accommodate him. For years, I tried to brush it off, but it's hard not to notice the favoritism. I started thinking back to a recent family dinner we had. It was a few weeks ago, and at the time, I didn't think much of it. We were all sitting around the table, and my mom made a comment about future plans and how everything was finally settled. I remember laughing it off as just vague talk, but now it feels like a piece of the puzzle I completely missed. After the coffee shop encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I decided to share what happened with my best friend, Chris. He's been my sounding board for years, and I knew he'd give me some perspective. I told him about what the lawyer said, and Chris was immediately suspicious. He pointed out how odd it was for Mr. Jenkins to let something like that slip, and suggested I confront my parents directly. It made sense, but I was hesitant. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I also couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. A few days later, I decided to visit my parents unannounced. I showed up at their house, and the vibe was off from the moment I walked in. My mom looked startled to see me, and there was this uncomfortable silence that hung in the air. When I casually brought up the topic of estate planning, she got defensive, saying it wasn't something I needed to worry about. It was clear she didn't want to talk about it, and my dad just sat there, not meeting my eyes. I left feeling even more uneasy. Something was definitely going on. I started noticing changes in my siblings too. My sister seemed unusually confident, almost smug, like she knew something I didn't. My brother, who usually doesn't talk about money, made a joke recently about not having to worry about finances ever again. It felt like a jab, though I couldn't figure out why. I couldn't take it anymore, so I confronted my sister. I asked her directly if she knew anything about changes to the will. She just smirked and said, "Don't worry about things that don't concern you." It was infuriating, and I left more confused than ever. Finally, I went to my mom again, trying to get a straight answer. I asked her what was going on, why I was being left out of these decisions. She didn't look at me, just said, "We've made decisions we believe are fair," and then changed the topic. It was like hitting a brick wall. I started panicking a bit after that. I've always assumed that there would be some sort of safety net, that if anything happened, my parents would have our backs. But now, it felt like I was being pushed out, excluded from whatever plans they were making. I kept thinking about all the times I'd been there for them, driving them to appointments, helping with the house, while my siblings barely lifted a finger. I decided I needed answers, so I called Mr. Jenkins. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but finally admitted there was indeed a change to the will. I wasn't included in it. He suggested I talk to my parents for more details, but I hung up, feeling like the floor had fallen out from under me. I never thought I'd be in this position, but here I am, blindsided by my own family. I can't let this slide. I need to find out why they cut me out, and I'm done playing nice. It's time to confront them and get the truth, once and for all. Update 1. After finding out that I was cut out of the will, I knew I couldn't just sit back and take it. I called my parents and siblings and told them we needed to meet. No more vague comments, no more dodging questions. I wanted answers, and I wanted them face to face. We agreed to meet at my parents' house, where all the family discussions have happened over the years. I remember walking in with my heart pounding, but I was determined. Whatever was going on, I wasn't leaving until I knew the truth. From the moment I stepped inside, the tension was thick. My mom was already in the living room, arms crossed, looking defensive. My dad was sitting quietly in his favorite armchair, staring at the floor. He wouldn't look at me, which was strange. Normally, he's the first to greet me, but this time it felt like he wanted to be anywhere but here. My sister was perched on the edge of the couch, scrolling through her phone like she couldn't care less. My brother, on the other hand, was leaning back with this smug look on his face, like he'd been waiting for this moment. He was the first to break the silence, chuckling and saying, "Well, it's about time we had this talk." That set the tone for the entire meeting. I knew then that whatever was about to happen, my brother was enjoying it. I didn't waste time. I asked them directly why I was removed from the will. I wanted a straight answer, no more evasions. My voice was steady, but I could feel the anger boiling underneath. My mom snapped back almost immediately, accusing me of being ungrateful. She said I had no right to question their decisions, and that I should be thankful for everything they've done for me. It was like she was trying to turn it around, making me look like the bad guy for even asking. My dad still hadn't said a word. He was slouched in his chair, avoiding eye contact. I could see his jaw clenching like he was struggling to keep quiet. It was obvious he was uncomfortable, but he wasn't stepping in to defend me or explain anything. I was on my own. Then my brother spoke up again, leaning forward with this arrogant grin. He said something like, "Oh, come on, you knew this was coming. You're always off doing your own thing. It's not like you needed their help anyway." He made it sound like it was obvious, like I should have expected this. It was infuriating, but before I could respond, my mom cut in again. She told me they made the change for my own good, saying I've always been independent and didn't need the financial support. She tried to spin it like it was a compliment, but it felt hollow. I've been the one who's helped them out the most, taking care of things, running errands, being there whenever they needed me. My siblings never did any of that. Her explanation didn't make sense, and I knew there had to be more to it. That's when my sister chimed in. She rolled her eyes and said, "You've never been around when it mattered," accusing me of distancing myself from the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I've always been the one making the effort to keep in touch, to check in on them. It was like she'd rewritten history, making me out to be the one who abandoned the family, when it was really her and my brother who barely showed up unless there was something in it for them. Finally, my dad spoke up, but it wasn't the defense I was hoping for. He said they changed the will after I had a falling out with my brother a few years ago. He claimed they thought it was better for family harmony if they left me out, as if that would solve anything. It was like he'd bought into this lie that I was the problem child, the one causing all the issues, despite everything I've done to keep the peace. Then my brother made a slip up. He mentioned that the new will was signed right after he and my sister took our parents on an expensive vacation. I hadn't known about this trip. They'd kept it quiet. Suddenly, it all clicked. It wasn't about me being independent or keeping the family harmonious. My siblings had manipulated our parents, taking them on a luxury trip right before convincing them to cut me out of the will. It was clear what had happened, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. I couldn't hold back anymore. I called them out right there, accusing them of scheming and using our parents for their own gain. My voice was loud, echoing in the room, but I didn't care. My mom started crying, saying I was being disrespectful, while my dad finally snapped and told me to leave if I couldn't be civil. It was like they couldn't see how they'd been played, or maybe they just didn't want to admit it. I stormed out, slamming the door behind me. I drove straight to Chris's place, feeling like I was about to explode. He let me in, and I vented everything. How they'd lied, how my siblings had manipulated the entire situation. Chris was furious on my behalf, telling me I needed to fight back legally. He said it sounded like undue influence and I should contest the will. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go that far, but I knew I couldn't just let it go. I called a lawyer the next day to set up a meeting. I needed to know my options, not for the money, but because I couldn't let them get away with this. My family had tried to push me out, and now I was ready to push back. This isn't about the inheritance anymore. It's about exposing the truth and reclaiming my place in this family. Update 2. After storming out of the family meeting, I knew I needed professional help. I set up an appointment with a lawyer who specializes in family disputes and inheritance issues. Her office was small but packed with books and files, a sign she'd been through this type of thing many times. She listened carefully as I explained everything, how the will was changed, the weird behavior from my parents, and the shady vacation my siblings took them on right before the new will was signed. She leaned back in her chair and told me that challenging a will isn't easy, but it's not impossible either. The key would be proving undue influence, that my siblings manipulated our parents into cutting me out. I felt hesitant. This was my family, after all. But if I was going to uncover what really happened, I needed to dig deeper, even if it made me the villain in their eyes. I started gathering evidence. I went through old emails and text messages, looking for anything that might show a pattern of manipulation. I found messages from my sister to our parents, always dripping with concern, talking about how worried she was about their future and subtly planting the idea that my brother and she would take care of everything. Meanwhile, she'd always paint me as distant, as if I wasn't part of the family circle. It was subtle, but I could see how these small comments might have influenced them over time. I decided to reach out to my aunt, my mom's sister. We've always been close, and she's the kind of person who notices everything but doesn't get involved unless asked. I met her for coffee, and when I brought up the changes to the will, her expression shifted. She told me she'd noticed a change in my mom's behavior over the past couple of years, especially after the vacation my siblings took her and my dad on. My aunt said my mom seemed more anxious, easily swayed by what my brother and sister were saying. She then mentioned that my sister had casually brought up the will update during a family gathering, saying it was for the best and that everyone would be happier this way. My aunt didn't push back at the time, but she admitted she thought it was odd. While I was trying to piece everything together, my brother made a public mistake. He posted a photo on social media of himself standing in front of a newly purchased house, captioned, "Early retirement plans coming together nicely." He tagged my parents, who responded with a smiling emoji. I stared at the screen, feeling a mixture of disbelief and anger. My brother was openly celebrating his future inheritance, while I was still reeling from the news that I was cut out. It was a slap in the face. A few days later, my sister called me out of nowhere. Her tone was fake sweet. but her words were sharp. She accused me of digging up dirt and trying to ruin the family's harmony. She said our parents were upset with me for stirring the pot and that I needed to let it go. I could tell she was trying to guilt trip me, making me question if I was really the problem, but her defensiveness only made me more certain that I was onto something. Then my dad called. He sounded weaker than I'd ever heard him. He mentioned that his health was declining and said he didn't want to leave behind a legacy of family conflict. He asked me to drop everything for the sake of peace. I listened quietly, feeling torn. My dad's voice was filled with genuine concern, but it also felt like another attempt to manipulate me, like my siblings had convinced him that I was the one causing all the trouble. I talked to Chris about it, and he didn't hold back. He reminded me that my dad's plea for peace was probably influenced by my siblings. He urged me to stay focused, saying that guilt was a powerful tool they were using against me. Feeling like I was missing something big, I hired a private investigator. It felt extreme, but I needed to know what was really going on behind the scenes. A week later, the investigator came back with a report that nearly floored me. My sister had just bought a brand new luxury car, and my brother made a sizable down payment on his new house. Both purchases happened shortly after the vacation they took my parents on. It was clear they were already spending money they didn't even have yet, banking on the inheritance coming their way. Armed with this new evidence, I called another family meeting. This time I was ready. I laid out everything: the timing of the vacation, the luxury purchases, and the messages I'd found showing my sister's subtle manipulation. My parents looked stunned, exchanging glances. It was obvious they had no idea where the money for these big purchases had come from. My siblings had kept them in the dark, just like they'd tried to do with me. My brother's face turned red. He stood up, shouting that I was spying on them, that I was a jealous loser who couldn't handle seeing them succeed. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the whole house shook. My sister didn't say a word, just sat there with her arms crossed, refusing to make eye contact. In the silence that followed, my mom finally broke down. She admitted that she felt pressured by my siblings to change the will. They'd convinced her that I was too independent and didn't need the money, while they were struggling. My dad looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He muttered that he never wanted any of this, that he just wanted to keep the family together. I left the house feeling hollow. I'd uncovered the truth, but now I wasn't sure what to do with it. I never wanted to destroy my family, but it's hard to ignore how easily they pushed me aside. I'm stuck now, wondering if I should continue the legal fight or try to piece together the shattered relationships. Either way, it feels like there's no winning in this situation. Update 3. After the second family meeting, I decided to pause my investigation. My mother's confession had hit me hard. I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep digging into the legal side of things, especially after seeing how shattered my parents looked when the truth came out. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads. Either I could go all in and fight this in court, or I could try to step back and see if there was any chance left to heal this mess. For a few weeks, I stayed quiet, hoping things would settle down. That's when the smear campaign started. I began receiving cold texts and voicemails from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. My brother had gone on a rampage, telling anyone who'd listen that I was greedy, that I'd lost my mind and was trying to tear the family apart for money. He painted me as the villain, and it worked. People started taking sides, and most seemed to believe his version of events. It was infuriating, but I held back, not wanting to add more fuel to the fire. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from my cousin, Lisa. She's always been the level-headed one in the family, and she said she'd been hearing whispers about what was happening. She told me she wasn't surprised. I wasn't the only one who noticed my siblings acting entitled over the years. She shared her own observations about how my sister had always dropped hints about things changing soon whenever she talked about our parents' estate. It was nice to know I wasn't completely alone in this, even if it was just one person. Lisa also dropped a bombshell. She'd overheard a conversation between my brother and my mom at a family barbecue a while back. They were discussing a secret account that my brother had set up with our mother. This account had seen some large deposits recently, and from the way my brother talked, it sounded like he was using it as a safety net, expecting a big payout once everything was finalized. I felt a surge of anger but also relief. This was the missing piece that explained a lot of their behavior. I decided it was time to talk to my dad alone. He'd been quiet throughout this whole ordeal, and I needed to hear from him directly. I went over to their house one evening when I knew my mom was out. My dad looked tired, older than I'd ever seen him. We sat down, and I told him everything I'd uncovered, including the secret account. He didn't seem surprised, just sad. He admitted that he'd felt pressured to go along with my siblings' demands. He said he'd hoped it would keep the peace, that he was afraid of losing his relationship with them if he didn't comply. Before I could respond, my dad suddenly clutched his chest, gasping for breath. I jumped up, dialing 911 immediately. The paramedics arrived quickly and rushed him to the hospital. I followed behind, my hands shaking the entire drive. When I got there, the rest of the family was already in the waiting room. My mom was pacing, her face pale, while my sister sat in the corner, tapping away on her phone. My brother looked irritated, as if this whole situation was an inconvenience. We waited for what felt like hours. My mom eventually broke down, sobbing into her hands. Through her tears, she apologized to me for the first time, saying she'd let herself be influenced because she was afraid of upsetting my siblings. She admitted she'd thought they were more fragile, that they needed her support more than I did. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small crack in the wall she'd built between us. Meanwhile, my sister leaned over to whisper something to my brother, who gave a quick, smug nod. They didn't look worried at all. They seemed more annoyed by the interruption to their plans. It was a small gesture, but it said everything about where their priorities lay. Finally, the doctor came out. He told us my dad had a mild heart attack, but would recover with rest and medication. For a moment, the tension in the room lifted as we all let out a collective sigh of relief. But it didn't last long. My sister turned to me and accused me of causing the heart attack, saying all the unnecessary drama I'd stirred up had pushed our dad over the edge. I felt the rage bubbling up, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew if I lost my temper, it would just prove her point. When my dad woke up, he asked to see me alone. I went into the room and he looked frail, but his eyes were clear. He apologized for everything, saying he'd been a coward for not standing up to my siblings. He said he was willing to change the will back to its original state, but only if I could find a way to make peace with them. He told me he didn't want his final days filled with conflict and begged me to try to reconcile. I stood there, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. My dad's request felt like a heavy weight. He was asking me to let go of everything, the betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, for the sake of family harmony. I told him I'd think about it, but I didn't know if I could forgive and forget so easily. I left the hospital and didn't say a word to my siblings as I walked past them. I need time to process everything. I'm not sure what my next move is, but one thing is clear. This family is broken in ways I never realized, and it's going to take more than an apology to fix it. For now, I'm not ready to forgive, but I'm willing to talk. I need to figure out if there's any path left to healing, or if the only way forward is to continue the fight. What do you all think? Should I try to reconcile for my dad's sake, or is it time to take a stand and go all the way with the legal battle? Update 4. I couldn't sleep for nights after my father's request. He'd asked me to make peace with my siblings in exchange for rewriting the will back to its original state. I kept replaying his words in my mind, torn between doing what he wanted and standing up for myself. The thought of dragging him, in his fragile state, through a bitter legal battle felt cruel. But letting my siblings get away with everything they'd done felt like a betrayal to everything I believed in. Just as I was starting to lean towards giving in, the private investigator I hired reached out with a new report. He'd found something big. My sister had been funneling money into an offshore account, but it wasn't just in her name. It was a joint account with my brother. They'd been quietly moving funds around, clearly preparing for a huge financial gain once the inheritance was finalized. This wasn't just a case of sibling rivalry anymore. It was planned and premeditated. They were working together, scheming behind everyone's back. Seeing the evidence in black and white brought a wave of sadness over me. I wasn't angry in that moment, I was just deeply disappointed. While I'd been chasing down legal leads and trying to understand what happened, they'd been busy ensuring their payday. It hurt more than anything else, that they'd chosen money over our relationship. I wanted to know why, and it was eating me up inside. Then, something strange happened. I got an anonymous letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the words scrawled in a shaky script. It warned me to drop my investigation, saying, "Family secrets are better left buried." The letter didn't have a signature, but it felt like a threat. Was it from my siblings? Or was there something even darker lurking in the background? The paranoia set in, making me feel like I was missing an even bigger piece of the puzzle. A few days later, I was at home, still reeling from the letter, when my mom showed up at my door unannounced. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red and puffy, and for a moment she just stood there in silence. Then she broke down, telling me she felt like she'd lost control of the family and didn't know what to do anymore. She begged me to let it go, saying it was tearing my dad apart, that his health couldn't take the stress. For the first time, I didn't back down. I told her I was willing to consider reconciliation, but only if my siblings admitted what they'd done and made things right. I wanted a full family meeting where everything would be put on the table, no more secrets, no more manipulations. She agreed to set it up, and a few days later, we all gathered once more at my parents' house. My siblings arrived with those familiar smug smiles, acting like nothing was wrong. They didn't seem nervous at all, which only made me angrier. They immediately went on the offensive, trying to turn the situation around on me. My sister accused me of being jealous and stirring up drama because I couldn't handle their close relationship with our parents. My brother chimed in, sneering that all of my problems were my own fault, that I distanced myself by choice. The meeting quickly spiraled into chaos. We were all yelling, talking over each other. My sister threw out accusations, claiming I was too busy with my own life to care about the family. It felt like they'd rehearsed this, like they were ready for a confrontation and were trying to paint me as the selfish one. I was about to lose it when, suddenly, my dad entered the room. He looked frail, leaning on the doorframe for support, but his voice was strong. He yelled for silence, something he hadn't done in years. The room went quiet immediately. He took a deep breath and said he was tired of the lies, tired of the manipulations. He admitted that he'd gone along with the will change because he was scared of losing his relationship with my siblings, scared of what might happen if he didn't keep the peace. Then, he dropped the bombshell. The real reason he agreed to change the will was because my mom had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. He feared that with his own health declining, she'd be vulnerable. He thought giving more to the younger siblings would ensure she was cared for, believing they'd be more present than I would be. I stood there, stunned. I'd missed the signs completely. The secrecy, the sudden changes, it all made sense now. I felt a wave of guilt for not realizing it sooner, but at the same time, I felt betrayed. They'd hidden this from me, used it as a tool for manipulation. My sister started crying immediately, claiming she had no idea about our mom's condition and that she only wanted to help. But her tears felt off, almost rehearsed. My brother, surprisingly, admitted he knew about it. He said they thought I wouldn't care, that I was too independent to worry about it. He apologized, but it didn't feel genuine. It felt like he was saying it because he got caught. My dad then said he wanted to rewrite the will again, this time ensuring fairness and setting up a trust for my mom's care. He pleaded with me to agree, saying it was his dying wish for the family to find peace. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, I wanted justice for everything they'd done. On the other hand, I could see how much this was tearing my dad apart. I'm at a crossroads. I don't know if I can forgive my siblings after everything, but I also don't want to be the one to deny my father his final wish. What would you do in my place? Should I let it go for the sake of family, or continue the fight for justice? Update 5. After my last update, I was overwhelmed by the responses from everyone. Some of you urged me to go full steam ahead with the legal battle, saying it's what I deserve after everything my siblings put me through. Others told me to choose peace, especially for the sake of my father's health. It made me realize that this decision wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about what kind of person I wanted to be and what kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. I took a step back to reflect on the whole situation. I thought about the good times with my parents, the family holidays, the laughter around the dinner table. Those moments felt like they happened in a different lifetime, but I missed them. I couldn't deny the anger I felt towards my siblings, but beneath that was a deep sadness for the years we'd lost, the connection that had frayed and maybe never existed the way I thought it did. I met with my lawyer one last time. She laid out our options, confident that we had a strong case for contesting the will. She didn't sugarcoat it, though. It would be a long, drawn-out process, potentially lasting years, and it would likely destroy any remaining chance of reconciliation with my family. I left her office feeling more conflicted than ever. A few days later, I went to visit my mom alone. She was having a good day, lucid, able to hold a conversation without trailing off. We sat in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed. She thanked me for being there, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. She admitted that she'd let my siblings influence her because she thought they needed her more. She said she always knew I'd be okay on my own, but now she realized she should have trusted me with the truth from the beginning. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get, and in that moment it was enough. I made my decision after that visit. I told my dad I wasn't going to contest the will. He looked surprised but relieved. I said I was willing to accept the new arrangement, as long as a portion of the estate went into a trust for my mom's care. He agreed immediately, clearly expecting a much bigger fight. My siblings, who had been bracing for a legal battle, were visibly shocked, but also relieved. They probably thought they'd won, but I didn't care anymore. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about letting go. In the days that followed, my brother reached out, saying he wanted to make amends. He told me he regretted how things had played out and wanted to start fresh. I agreed to give it a chance, but I set firm boundaries. We've been meeting for coffee once a month since then, talking about work, sharing updates about our own families. It's not perfect, but we're both making an effort, and that's more than I expected. My sister, on the other hand, didn't take the news well. She kept her distance, barely making eye contact during our last meeting with the lawyer. She seemed more concerned about how this change affected her plans. A few weeks later, she moved away without telling anyone. I found out from a mutual friend that she'd cut off most contact with the family. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Part of me hoped she'd come around eventually, but deep down, I knew she might never change. The will was rewritten with my input, ensuring equal shares for all three of us and a significant trust set up for my mom's care. The lawyer finalized everything, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was the best one I could hope for given the circumstances. A few weeks after the new will was signed, my dad passed away peacefully in his sleep. We came together as a family for the funeral, putting aside our differences, if only for a moment, to say goodbye. It was a somber, quiet day. We shared stories about him, remembering the good times. For a brief moment, it felt like the old days, before everything got so complicated. In the months that followed, my mom's dementia progressed quickly. I started visiting her regularly, bringing old photo albums and sharing stories from my childhood. Sometimes she'd smile, recognizing a memory. Other times, she'd look at me like I was a stranger. It was bittersweet, but I was grateful for the moments when she knew who I was. Life slowly started to move on. I reconnected with old friends, got back into hobbies I'd abandoned during the chaos of the past year. I focused on my own healing, learning to find joy in small moments again. It wasn't easy, but it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I know not everyone will agree with my choice. Some might say I took the easy way out by not contesting the will, but I didn't choose this path because it was easier. I chose it because it felt like the right thing to do. I chose to put my family before my pride, to try and mend what was broken instead of tearing it apart further. Thank you to everyone who followed along and supported me through this journey. Your advice and encouragement helped me more than you'll ever know. I'm logging off now to focus on my family and my own healing process. It's time for me to move forward and close this chapter.